The reading will be from 2 Samuel 29 through 31. 2 Samuel 29 through 31. For you are my lamp, O Lord. The Lord God shall enlighten my darkness. For by you I can run along against a troop. For by God I can leap over a wall. But as for God, the way is perfect. The word of the Lord is proven. He is a shield to all who trust in him.
Be seated, please. Here in the passage, David is shouting a song of praise to God. He had been victorious over the enemies, and he knows that the only reason he's victorious is not because of him, but because of what God can do. And it's rather interesting there in that passage of the things that David says, I can do this, I can do that. And the reason he can do that, reminding us of Philippians 4:13, is that it's God that is with him, that is strengthening him. You know, we live in a world today where ultimately your basic philosophy, the things that you live by, all those attitudes of life, whether they're the can-do attitude versus the I can't do this or can't do that, all make a great difference in regard to one's life and the way that one looks at life. I read recently about a man that was known as a very positive, can-do kind of person. He, wherever he went, had a good attitude. Someone would ask him, how do you feel? He said, I feel so good. He said, I feel like I got twins because I feel that good. I'm that double blessed in regard to the way he looked at life. And as an employer, he made a note to all of his employees that regardless of what they dealt with in life, particularly in the business world, every single day, he says you have a choice. You can choose to be a victim, or you can choose to be a winner. You can choose that regardless of what happens to you, that you will have a positive attitude toward what you're dealing with in life and how you face it in life. The man that was writing the article about this said that later on he left the business and started his own business. And a few months later on, he read that this particular man, this employer of his that had this can-do attitude, had fallen off of a communications tower about 60 feet, had broken all kinds of bones in his body. They operated on him for 18 hours. And eventually, months later on, the man had gotten well. This particular guy ran into him, and he said, how are you doing? To which the man responded, as he always did, he said, man, I feel so good, I feel like I'm a twin. He said, you want to see my scars? And this friend of his said, no, I really don't want to see your scars. He said, but I want to ask you, how were you able to deal with this great trauma in your life? He said, what's the first thing you thought of when you fell? He said, when I came to, I thought about my soon-to-be born daughter and that she needed a daddy. And he said, I decided right then, regardless of how bad I am, I'm going to live through this. He said, I got the EMT folks got me. They put me in the ambulance. They raced me to the hospital. And he said it was then that I got real concerned. Because he said, as an employer, I've often learned body language, and I've often learned to look in people's eyes as to what they're thinking. And he said, when I saw the nurses and the doctors, I saw great concern. I saw almost hopelessness. He said they were checking me out and getting ready to rush me into surgery, and said the doctors were doing different things and the nurses were doing different things. And he said this burly female nurse stopped and said, are you allergic to anything? And he said, with the most strength that I had still left in my body before passing out and getting ready for surgery, I yelled, yes. And they all stopped. And he said, I'm allergic to gravity. And they all laughed. And he said, operate on me as if I'm alive, not that I'm going to die. He said that made the difference not just in the way those doctors operated on me and they took care of me in that hospital for that number of months, but he said it's still the best kind of attitude in life. I thought it was interesting, just 12 times in the Bible you'll find the phrase I can. 35 times I cannot. What we want to do this afternoon is go to the book of Daniel, and we're going to look at the little Hebrew word that talks about can being able to or cannot not being able to. And all we're going to do is just turn to, for example, in Daniel chapter 2, notice the narrative in regard to how this phrase is used here in this particular text. Daniel 2, verse 10 and 11. You may remember that Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and he's told all of the magicians, the astrologers, all the other individuals, you better interpret this dream or else. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there's not a man on earth that can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such thing of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no one who can tell it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. And in other words, they're saying, this cannot be done. King, we cannot tell you what you just dreamed. We'll look at verse 27 and verse 28. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. In other words, Daniel said, what those guys said is true. They can't do it. But there's a God in heaven that can. Look at verse 46, 47. After he told the dream, Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, commanded them that they should present an offering and incense to him. The king answered Daniel and said, truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. In other words, man cannot, but God can. Look at the next chapter, chapter 3, 16, verse 17, in regard to the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar sets up, and Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego have to deal with it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But notice verse 19. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. In other words, regardless of what you say, we can't do it. Verse 28, verse 29. And the satraps, the administrators, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose body the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected. The smell of fire was not on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any God except their own God. I ask you, have you ever thought about where the rest of the Jews were on this occasion? I wonder if they were the ones who bowed down. Because only 3 men are mentioned in the text as saying, regardless of what the decree is, and regardless of this fiery furnace, and regardless of what you say is going to happen to us, we cannot, because we serve an almighty God. Look at chapter 4 in regard to now his, or in regard to what he says, verse 18. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, declare an interpretation, since all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, for the Spirit of the Holy God is in you. What's interesting is that when Belteshazzar or Daniel interprets this dream, Nebuchadnezzar is convinced there's only one God. Now, there were a lot of gods of the Chaldeans. There were a lot of false gods. But he knew and he recognized there was just one that could do something. Verse 37. Now Nebuchadnezzar praise and exalt, extol, and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are true and his ways justice. And those who walk in pride he is able to put down. In other words, man cannot, but God can. Look at chapter 5 and verse 16. Belshazzar, who is now Nebuchadnezzar's son, he also sees a vision. Verse 16. And I have heard of you, this is Belshazzar speaking to Daniel, that you give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Isn't it interesting that even now we got a second generation king who's heard what Daniel's God can do for him? Chapter 6, it continues on in regard to the Persian king. Look at verse 4 and verse 5. You may recall that Daniel's been given great authority, one of the great governors of the kingdom. All of the Persians don't like it. Why? He's a foreigner. And yet he's over us? How in the world, what are we going to do with this guy? Well, look at what they do. Chapter 6, verse 4 and 5. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could not find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. We've often said before, it didn't matter where Daniel was, like that of Joseph back in Egypt, they were going to be right with God. And that's exactly what these men say. The only way we're going to find anything that we can blackmail him with or against the king is because he serves one God. Look at verse 19 and verse 20 after the fact. The king went to his palace, verse 18, and spent the night fasting, and no magicians were brought before him, and also his sleep went from him. The king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions, and when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouth so that they would not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. What's so special about Daniel, even today? What's special about those 3 Hebrew children? I think it has to be that they realize that while one by themselves cannot, in and on their own strength, that God can. Tommy in his prayer mentioned that we live in a chaotic world, I believe. Maybe he mentioned. You know, we need to know that in the midst of a world that sadly sometimes has gone crazy, God can give us peace and harmony. Now, it may not be defined the way we'd like for it to be. It's not going to mean that everything's going to fall in place the way we want it to all the time. If you're faithful to God, just because you walk out the doors of this building does not mean that you'll have to deal with adversity, that you won't be challenged, that your faith may be shook or at least tested, or that something bad will happen perhaps to you or to someone you love. But the fact of the matter is that in the midst of the world you and I face, we may at times struggle with the fact that we cannot. But we always need to know that God can. He therefore gives us the strength to keep going on. I appreciate so very much the example of so many of you in so many different places where you go, of trying to be an encouragement, of trying to be a stabilizing influence in the homes or in the lives or in the connections of life that you're involved in. As Paul said in Philippians 4, I'm able to do that because of Christ who's in me. And the same is true for us. Again, Daniel is just one example. We could have gone to many other examples in the Scriptures, both Old and New Testament, where by ourselves we can't, but with God on our side we can. God helps us with the answers. They're found in the book. Maybe they're not the answers we want to have. We like sometimes to look for other answers, but He tells us how to live. He also hears our cries. He hears our concerns. Please don't ever underestimate the power of prayer in the life of a child of God. Because the Bible tells us that as He wills, according to His word, 1 John chapter 5, verse 14, He'll answer according to His will what is best for each one of us. He'll help us to be patient with others. And that's a hard one, isn't it? I think someone's often said, never pray for patience, God may give it to you. And I think probably some of us have done that before. Patient with situations that we don't like, that we don't condone, that we wish never happened. On and on we could go with situations of life that we find ourselves in or that others that we care for are in. But through it all, just as God is patient with us, He teaches us to be patient with others. And then also to realize that I can't do it by myself, but that He can. And that's what we're here for. Collectively, as a group of God's people, this church family, working together to make everything right and good and the best it can possibly be. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Nebuchadnezzar said, look, unless you people do what I tell you to do, you're going to die. Daniel said, these people can't do it, but the God I serve can. Folks, we're several thousand years removed from that event of history, but the same God still can do those things as He sees fit and willing in our life. May we have the strength, the power, the fortitude, most of all the faith to stay through, be with Him, to live for Him. The same is true about Jesus. We cannot, but Jesus already has done. Remember that the next time you're tempted, the next time you want to cave in, the next time the world tries to crunch you into its mode, Paul says, Romans chapter 12, don't let them do so. You be different. You'd be transformed by that mind like that of Jesus. The Lord wants you to respond. If you have that need, once you come, let's go. We stand and sing together.